The red and blue lights cast erratic flashes across Ava Carter's terrified face as she stood beside her silver SUV, her arms raised in forced surrender. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out the distant hum of suburban traffic. 3 officers surrounded her, white, armed, and grinning like predators. Her trunk lay open, its contents charity brochures, tablecloths, children's books strewn across the pavement as if they were evidence of some unspoken crime. Officer Trent Calloway stepped forward, his sneer deepening. "What else you hiding, sweetheart?" His voice was syrupy with condescension, thick with the certainty of unchecked power. Ava swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had done nothing wrong. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't rolled through a stop sign. Her phone remained untouched in the cup holder. But none of that mattered. She forced her voice to stay steady. "Can I call my husband now?" Calloway's smirk widened. He was enjoying this. "Not unless you want to spend the night in a cell." Ava's fingers trembled as she reached for her phone anyway, dialing the only number that mattered. Darren Carter, Captain, Houston Police Department. The moment the call connected, the camera on her screen zoomed in on the name. The world around her blurred as a deep voice filled her ear. "Ava, what's wrong?" Before she could answer, tires screeched in the distance. A black SUV tore into the street, its headlights slicing through the night. The doors flew open, and out stepped Darren Carter, his polished badge catching the glow of the flashing lights. His face was carved from stone, his eyes dark with fury. His voice was like steel. "Drop everything. Step away from my wife." The officers stiffened. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of something unspoken: fear, recognition, maybe even regret. Calloway's smirk faltered, his hand twitching toward his belt, but Darren wasn't playing games. "I said step back." Everything froze. For a single moment, the world held its breath. But how did it come to this? Let's rewind 12 hours before the flashing lights, before the confrontation, before Ava Carter became a target in a battle she never asked to fight. And let's find out if justice is ever really safe in a system built to protect its own. The Houston skyline shimmered under the morning sun as Ava Carter stood outside the Willow Creek Community Center, watching volunteers load boxes of supplies into the back of a delivery van. The crisp fall air carried the sounds of laughter and conversation, an energy that made all the months of planning worth it. The annual charity gala had been a huge success. They had raised enough funds to keep the community's youth literacy program alive for another year. Ava could still see the excitement in the children's faces, their eyes lighting up at the promise of new books, tutoring sessions, and a safe space to learn. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Darren Carter, Captain, HPD. A small smile tugged at her lips as she read the message. "Sorry I missed the gala, love. Work's crazy. Home by 8. Dinner on me." Ava shook her head, her smile lingering. Darren was always working, always pulled in different directions by his new role as captain. But no matter how exhausted he was, he always made time for her, even if it was just for a late dinner and stolen moments between shifts. By the time the last box was secured, the sky had begun to dim, washing the city in golden hues. Ava waved goodbye to the volunteers, locked up the center, and climbed into her silver SUV. The route home was familiar: 30 minutes through quiet suburban streets, past rows of manicured lawns, porch lights flickering on, and children playing their final games of the evening. This was the kind of neighborhood where people walked their dogs without fear, where kids rode bikes without parents watching their backs. Ava took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion settle in. The night promised leftovers and a movie, a rare quiet evening. Her Bluetooth crackled to life as she merged onto the freeway. Darren's voice filled the car, warm but tired. "How'd it go?" Ava leaned back against the headrest, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. "Better than expected. We raised enough to fund the program through next year. The kids were so excited, I wish you could have seen it." Darren sighed. "I wish I could have too, but I'm proud of you, Ava. Always." They talked about small things, weekend plans, a friend's baby shower, until Darren was called back to duty. "Love you. Drive safe," he said before hanging up. Ava glanced at the clock. 9:17 p.m. The freeway emptied as she exited onto quieter back roads, streetlights flickering between patches of darkness. It was a stretch she had driven countless times, but tonight, something felt off. Her rearview mirror caught movement, a patrol car trailing her. Ava frowned, checking her speed. 32 mph in a 35 zone. No rolling stops, no phone use, everything by the book. Yet the car stayed close, block after block, turn after turn. Ava switched lanes. So did they. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Maybe they're just heading the same way, she told herself, forcing calm into her breath. But deep down, her gut twisted with unease. At the next red light, her worst fear became reality. Red and blue lights exploded behind her, painting the interior of her SUV in flashing colors. Ava's stomach dropped. Her hands trembled as she signaled, pulled over, and shifted the SUV into park. The hum of the engine faded, leaving behind only the pounding of her heartbeat. In the rearview mirror, she watched the officer step out, a tall, white man with a rigid posture, his hand already resting on the grip of his holstered gun. Ava inhaled deeply, whispering to herself, "Routine stop. Nothing to worry about." But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't routine, and it was only the beginning. The flashing lights behind Ava Carter's SUV felt surreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel as she shifted into park. The soft hum of the engine faded, leaving only the pounding of her heartbeat. In the rearview mirror, she watched as Officer Trent Calloway stepped out of the patrol car. Tall, white, smug. His hand rested on the grip of his holstered gun, his approach deliberate, calculated. Ava forced herself to remain calm, rolling down her window with steady hands. She knew the drill. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Her voice was polite, controlled. Calloway didn't answer right away. He took his time, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering just long enough to make it clear that he was in control. Finally, he spoke. "License and registration." Ava blinked. No greeting, no explanation. Straight to demands. She nodded, moving deliberately, her motions slow just as her parents had taught her. Never move too fast. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. As she handed over her documents, she dared to ask, "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Calloway barely glanced at her license before smirking. "Suspicious activity reported in the area. Your vehicle matches the description." Ava's breath caught. Suspicious activity? In a silver SUV? While wearing an evening gown, coming from a charity event? The absurdity of the accusation made her stomach churn. "There must be a mistake," she said, keeping her voice even. "I just left the Willow Creek Community Center." Calloway's smirk deepened. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Ava's fingers clenched around the steering wheel. "Excuse me? I haven't done anything wrong. Are you detaining me?" He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath laced with amusement. "I said step out of the car." Before she could respond, another patrol car pulled up behind them. Two more officers stepped out, one older, his expression hardened, and the other younger, shifting nervously under the streetlights. Ava's chest tightened. 3 officers, for 1 woman, on a quiet suburban street. This wasn't a routine stop. This was intimidation. "Okay," she murmured, unbuckling her seatbelt with deliberate slowness. "I'm complying, but I'd like to know why I'm being treated this way." Calloway didn't answer. Instead, he signaled to the younger officer, who moved toward her trunk and popped it open. Ava's heart pounded as they began rifling through her things. Fundraiser materials, leftover decorations, stacks of children's books tossed aside like garbage. "Hey!" Ava snapped, frustration cracking through her composure. "You can't search my car without consent or probable cause." The older officer, Sergeant Greg Lewis, let out a chuckle. "Probable cause? Your attitude's enough for me." Ava's stomach twisted in rage. This wasn't about the law. This was about power. She glanced at her phone, still sitting in the cup holder, its screen glowing faintly. "If she could just call Darren, hands where I can see them," Calloway barked, his hand moving toward his taser. Ava froze. One wrong move. One misunderstanding, and that's all it would take for this to escalate beyond control. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm not resisting. I just want to call my husband." Calloway sneered. "You can do that after we're done here." The younger officer, clearly uneasy, held up a stack of flyers, flipping through them like they were evidence of a crime. "What's all this?" Ava's patience cracked. "Literacy program flyers. For children. From the charity event I just left." "Are you serious right now?" The older officer laughed, shaking his head. "You people always got some charity angle, don't you?" "You people." The words hit her like a slap. Ava bit her tongue, fighting the surge of anger rising in her chest. Reacting meant escalation, and escalation meant danger. Calloway turned to the younger officer. "Run her plates. Let's see what else she's hiding." Ava stood still, arms crossed tightly, every muscle screaming to flee. But she knew better. Running wasn't an option, not for someone like her. Her phone buzzed again, her last hope. Darren. Ava inhaled sharply. "May I retrieve my phone to call my husband now?" Calloway exchanged a glance with the older officer before nodding. No sudden moves. Carefully, Ava leaned into the car, grabbed her phone, and pressed the call button. Her heart hammered in her chest as the line rang. Darren answered immediately. "Ava, you okay? I've been calling you." She didn't waste time. "Darren, I'm pulled over. They're searching my car without cause. I need you here, now." Silence. Then Darren's voice sharp, commanding. "Where are you?" Ava rattled off the street name, her voice cracking. "Please hurry." As she ended the call, the officers stiffened, their postures shifting. They didn't know who she had called, but something about her sudden confidence unsettled them. The night air grew thick with tension. Minutes passed like hours. Ava refused to look away, refused to shrink under their scrutiny. And then, in the distance, the low growl of an engine, growing louder. A black SUV rolled up sleek, deliberate. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Darren Carter. Tall, broad-shouldered, radiating authority. His badge gleamed under the streetlight, but it wasn't the metal that made the officers freeze. It was the look in his eyes. Cold, unforgiving, and very, very dangerous. Ava let out a shaky breath. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Darren Carter stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the streetlight, his eyes sharp as steel. The air around them thickened with tension, the officers shifting uneasily under his gaze. "Somebody," Darren said, his voice low and razor-sharp, "better explain why my wife is standing here like a suspect while you tear through her belongings." Officer Trent Calloway squared his shoulders, his usual smirk struggling to stay in place. "Sir, we received a report." "A report of what?" Darren cut him off. "A well-dressed black woman driving home from a charity event, in a registered vehicle, with no infractions?" Sergeant Greg Lewis stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Captain Carter, we were just following protocol." Darren's jaw clenched. "That's funny, because I don't recall harass an innocent woman being in the department's protocol." He turned to Calloway. "Did she consent to this search?" Silence. Darren took another step forward. "I asked you a question, Officer Calloway." Calloway's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, sir." Darren exhaled sharply, his temper barely contained. "That's what I thought. Call your supervisor. Now." Calloway hesitated, exchanging a glance with Lewis. "I said now." With clear reluctance, Calloway reached for his radio. Minutes later, a new patrol car arrived, and out stepped Lieutenant Frank Sutton, his expression already laced with irritation. Darren barely waited for him to speak. "Your officers conducted an illegal search, denied my wife the right to call counsel, and treated her like a criminal on a bogus stop." Darren's voice was controlled but deadly. "This isn't going away." Sutton sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, Captain, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Your wife is free to go." Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but Darren didn't move. "No," he said. "I want badge numbers, incident reports, and body cam footage by morning." Sutton's jaw tightened. "I'll see what I can do." "See that you do," Darren shot back. "Because if I find out footage mysteriously disappears, I will take this straight to the mayor." A flicker of something uncertainty, maybe even fear, crossed Sutton's face. He knew Darren wasn't bluffing. Finally, Sutton waved a dismissive hand. "Take your wife home, Captain. We'll sort this out." Darren turned to Ava, gently placing a hand on her lower back. "Let's go." As they pulled away from the curb, Ava's hands trembled on the steering wheel. The night's events played over in her mind like a haunting reel. Calloway's sneer, the humiliation of having her things tossed onto the street, the way their hands had hovered over their weapons, as if she was a threat. She gripped the wheel tighter. "They're going to come after us for this." Darren's voice was steady, his eyes fixed on the road. "Let them try." By morning, Darren filed an official complaint against Calloway, Lewis, and Sutton, detailing the illegal search, racial profiling, and intimidation tactics. But he already knew how this would play out. And he was right. Later that day, Ava stepped outside the Willow Creek Community Center, arms full of paperwork, only to find a bright orange parking ticket slapped onto her windshield. No parking zone. Her brows furrowed. She had parked in the same designated space she always did. She ripped the ticket from the glass and turned just in time to see a patrol car idling across the street. Calloway sat in the driver's seat, watching her, his smirk returning. Ava's blood boiled. This was a warning. That evening, Darren's office phone rang. It was Lieutenant Sutton. "Captain Carter, a word of advice." His voice was casual, almost lazy. "I'd suggest your wife keep a low profile for a while. You know how these things go." Darren's grip on the phone tightened. "Is that a threat, Lieutenant?" "Just looking out for you, Captain." A pause. "Have a good night." Click. Ava stood in the doorway, watching the anger flicker across Darren's face. "They're retaliating," she murmured. Darren nodded, jaw tight. "And it's only the beginning." 2 nights later, it happened again. Ava was heading home from the grocery store when the familiar red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Her pulse spiked as she pulled over, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The door opened before she could even unbuckle her seatbelt. Calloway. His smug grin sent chills down her spine. "Evening, ma'am," he drawled. "License and registration." Ava's voice wavered, but she held her ground. "I wasn't speeding. I didn't run a light." "What's the reason for this stop?" Calloway's eyes glinted. "Routine check." "Liar." "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Ava's pulse thundered in her ears. "Not without cause." Calloway's smile widened. "I said step out." Before she could react, he reached for the door handle and yanked it open. Ava barely had time to unbuckle before rough hands grabbed her, shoving her against the side of the SUV. "Stop resisting!" Calloway barked. Ava wasn't resisting, but that didn't matter. Her groceries spilled onto the pavement, milk pooling on the concrete, oranges rolling into the gutter. Her phone tumbled from her pocket, the screen lighting up with Darren's name. Her wrists burned as the cuffs snapped around them. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was in the back of a patrol car, humiliated, trembling, waiting for Darren, for justice, for this nightmare to end. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Ava Carter's wrists as she sat rigid in the back of the patrol car. Her breathing was shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was punishment for daring to stand up, for refusing to be silent. Outside, Officer Trent Calloway stood with his arms crossed, smirking as if he had already won. The younger officer, Greg Lewis, looked less certain, shifting uneasily under the glow of the streetlights. He knew this was wrong. Ava clenched her fists. So did she. A distant roar of an engine split the silence. Darren. The black SUV swerved to a halt, and Captain Darren Carter was out before the vehicle had fully stopped, his badge glinting under the harsh lights. "Get her out of that car, now." His voice was quiet but lethal. Calloway didn't move. "She was obstructing." "I don't want to hear it," Darren snapped. "Uncuff my wife, this second." Lieutenant Frank Sutton arrived just in time to watch the standoff unfold. He exhaled loudly, stepping between them. "Captain Carter, let's not escalate this." Darren's hands curled into fists. "You escalated this the moment your officers put their hands on my wife." Sutton sighed. "Fine, let's call it a misunderstanding." He turned to Calloway. "Uncuff her." Calloway looked furious but obeyed, jerking the cuffs off Ava's wrists with unnecessary force. She pulled her arms close to her chest, ignoring the sting where the metal had bitten into her skin. Darren placed a protective hand on her back. "Are you okay?" Ava exhaled shakily. "I will be." As they drove away, Ava's body remained tense, her hands balled into fists in her lap. The flashing lights faded in the rearview mirror, but the humiliation clung to her skin like a brand. "They won't stop," she murmured. Darren's jaw was tight. "Then neither will we." The next morning, Darren walked into Internal Affairs and filed a formal complaint citing racial profiling, illegal search and seizure, and harassment. He submitted the dashcam footage request, fully expecting the excuse that had become all too familiar. Later that afternoon, Ava met with investigative journalist Jessica Lane in a small cafe away from prying eyes. Jessica's sharp gaze flicked to Ava's bruised wrists as she placed her recorder on the table. "Tell me everything." Ava told her everything from the first stop to the vandalism, to the fake tickets, and now, the wrongful detainment. Jessica listened intently, taking furious notes. "This isn't just about you," Jessica murmured when Ava finished. "It's about every black driver who's been stopped for no reason, every officer who abuses their badge, and every victim too afraid to fight back." Ava swallowed. "Then let's fight." That night, Darren's phone rang. "Lieutenant Sutton." "Captain, I'd rethink your complaint," Sutton said smoothly. "It'd be a shame if this got ugly." Darren's grip on the phone tightened. Are you threatening me? Sutton chuckled. Just giving you a friendly warning. Click. The next morning, Ava left the community center to find all 4 of her tires slashed. Across the street, Calloway sat in his patrol car, watching, smirking. Ava's hands trembled as she dialed Darren. They're escalating. Darren didn't hesitate. Then we escalate too. 2 days later, the investigative report dropped. A pattern of abuse, how the HPD protects its own. Jessica's report detailed everything: the stops, the threats, the retaliation. It included witness accounts, legal violations, and Darren's official complaint. The public outcry was immediate. Protests erupted outside the Houston Police Department demanding justice. Social media exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForAva. Under mounting pressure, the mayor's office announced an independent review. Calloway and Lewis were placed on administrative leave. Sutton remained untouched. That night, as Ava and Darren sat in their living room, Darren's phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. Back off, Captain, before someone gets hurt. Ava stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. Darren exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. They think they can scare us. Ava's voice was steady. Then they don't know who they're dealing with. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The city was buzzing. Jessica Lane's explosive report had sent shockwaves through Houston. The protests outside police headquarters were growing by the day, banners reading, "Who protects us from the police?" and "Haha, justice for Ava," waving in the air. The department had been forced to act, placing Calloway and Lewis on leave, launching an internal review. But Darren and Ava weren't naive. They knew this wasn't a victory. Not yet. And then, the retaliation shifted. Darren was in his office reviewing his latest case files when Sergeant Olivia Torres knocked on his door. She closed it behind her, her expression tense. "We need to talk." Darren straightened. "What is it?" Torres hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "There's a leak." Darren's brow furrowed. "A leak?" Torres nodded. "Someone close to you is feeding information to Sutton and the higher-ups. Every move you make, every meeting you have, they know." Darren's stomach turned. He had suspected something was off, but hearing it confirmed made his pulse spike with anger. "Who?" Torres exhaled, hesitating before speaking the name. "Marcus Hale." The name hit Darren like a punch to the gut. Marcus, his former partner, his closest friend on the force, a man he had trusted for years betraying him. Darren's hands clenched into fists. "You're sure?" Torres slid a folder across his desk. Darren flipped it open, his eyes scanning the contents: emails, message logs, surveillance reports. Marcus had been feeding updates to Sutton, warning him about Darren's complaints, Ava's meetings, and even the protest strategies. Darren exhaled sharply, his heart hammering with a mixture of rage and disbelief. That evening, Darren met Marcus at a small diner on the east side of town, far from their usual precinct haunts. Marcus was already there, stirring his coffee, looking up with a forced smile as Darren slid into the booth across from him. "Darren, wasn't expecting to hear from you." Darren placed the folder on the table, his voice low. "Cut the bullshit, Marcus. I know." Marcus froze, his fingers tightening around his cup. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me." Darren's voice was sharp. "You've been feeding Sutton information. You sold us out." Marcus's jaw tightened before he let out a slow breath. "I didn't have a choice." Darren laughed, but there was no humor in it. "There's always a choice." Marcus looked away. "You don't get it, man. After Parker went down, the department didn't back down, they doubled down. I had 2 options, play along or lose everything. My job, my pension, my family's security." Darren shook his head in disgust. "And what about me, Marcus? What about Ava? You think they'll just stop at intimidation? They slashed her tires. They put their hands on her. What happens when they go further?" Marcus swallowed hard. "I didn't give them everything. I kept the real ammunition out of their hands." Darren's glare hardened. "You think that makes it better?" Silence stretched between them before Marcus finally spoke. "There's something you don't know." Darren leaned forward. "Then start talking." Marcus hesitated before lowering his voice. "Sutton isn't the one running this. He's just a piece of it. The real power? It's Assistant Chief William Cormack." Darren's breath caught. Cormack, a man who had shaken his hand at promotions, smiled at department events, and now he was pulling the strings behind the scenes. "He's the one keeping the gears turning," Marcus continued. "He authorized the shutdown of body cam footage. He flagged Ava's community center as a potential threat zone. He's the reason this isn't just about Calloway anymore. Darren stared at him, his anger shifting into something colder, sharper determination. "You want to fix this?" Darren said. "Give me proof." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get it." Darren stood. "You better, because if you don't, I will bring down every last one of you." As he walked out of the diner, Darren felt the shift. This wasn't just about a few corrupt cops anymore. This was about dismantling an entire system, and he wasn't backing down. The moment Darren Carter left the diner, the weight of Marcus Hale's confession settled over him like a storm cloud. Assistant Chief William Cormack. The name had always carried authority, a polished reputation built over decades. Now, Darren saw it for what it truly was: a shield, a front for a man who had orchestrated years of corruption. As Darren drove home, his mind raced. This was bigger than Calloway, bigger than Sutton. Cormack had turned the department into his personal kingdom, protecting bad cops and silencing anyone who dared to challenge the system. A text popped up on his phone screen. "Ava. Come home. Now." Darren's pulse spiked. He pressed harder on the gas. When he pulled into the driveway, his stomach twisted. The front porch lights cast an eerie glow on the scene before him. Their living room window was shattered, glass littering the porch steps. Red spray paint stretched across the garage door. "Back off!" Ava stood on the front steps, arms crossed tightly, her face pale with anger. "They did this while I was inside." Darren's breath left him in a slow, controlled exhale. "Did you see who?" She shook her head. "No cameras caught them. They knew exactly where the blind spots were, but I know who's behind it." Darren already knew too. Cormac's message was clear. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was war. By morning, Jessica Lane's second expose hit the news. From traffic stop to target, how a family became the victims of police retaliation. She laid out everything: the false tickets, the illegal stops, the threats, the vandalism. The story included images of their home, the shattered glass, the words spray-painted in bold red. It was no longer just about Ava and Darren. It was about power and the lengths the system would go to protect itself. The public's response was immediate. The protests outside police headquarters swelled not just activists now, but families, citizens who had their own stories of abuse. The hashtag #Justice for Ava trended nationwide. Then, the pressure forced the city to act. That afternoon, the mayor held an emergency press conference. "In light of recent allegations, we are launching a full investigation into the Houston Police Department's internal affairs and misconduct cases. No officer is above the law." Darren and Ava watched from their living room. For the first time in days, Ava exhaled a breath that almost sounded like relief. "They're scared," she murmured. Darren nodded, but his jaw was tight. Not scared enough. That night, Darren's phone rang. "Unknown number." He answered. A distorted voice rasped through the speaker. "Think you've won? We're just getting started." The line went dead. Darren stared at the phone, his grip tightening. Ava watched him carefully, her face unreadable. "What did they say?" Darren exhaled slowly. "They're not done." Ava swallowed hard but lifted her chin. "Neither are we." This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The air in the Carter household was thick with unspoken tension. The latest threat still hung between them, unspoken but understood. Darren sat at the dining table, his laptop open, scanning through every piece of evidence they had gathered. Ava stood nearby, her arms crossed. "They won't stop, Darren." Her voice was firm, but beneath it he heard the exhaustion, the frustration, the fear. Darren didn't look up. "Then we don't stop either." His fingers moved quickly as he uploaded files to a secure cloud server. They weren't taking any chances. The evidence was damning. Dispatch logs proving Sutton authorized the harassment. Body cam activation failures all linked back to Cormac's office. Emails marking the community center as a potential threat zone. Surveillance reports on their movements. Darren's phone buzzed. Sergeant Olivia Torres. "Tell me you have something," Darren answered. Torres's voice was low, urgent. "I have more than something. Cormac's office is burning evidence." Darren sat up. "What?" "The mayor's investigation is making them nervous. Cormac's ordering files destroyed. He's erasing records. If we don't move now, everything we have on him disappears." Ava's stomach twisted. We need to go public. Now. Darren immediately called Jessica Lane, the journalist who had already brought their case to national attention. We're not waiting anymore, Darren said, his voice edged with urgency. We have proof that Assistant Chief William Cormack is behind this. He's the one pulling the strings. Jessica was silent for a beat, then her voice sharpened. Send me everything. I'll have it on the air by tonight. Ava's hands were shaking as she helped Darren transfer the files. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about a citywide corruption ring. This was about every innocent person who had been targeted, every case swept under the rug. By 7 p.m., the story broke. Corruption at the highest levels, the truth behind Houston PD's retaliation tactics. The news anchor's voice was serious as emails and dispatch records flashed across the screen. Assistant Chief William Cormack authorized multiple acts of police misconduct, including the intimidation and targeting of citizens who spoke out against corruption. Internal memos reveal a system designed to shield officers from accountability. Leaked documents expose an internal effort to silence Captain Darren Carter and his wife, Ava Carter, after they reported racial profiling and illegal searches. Social media exploded. The protests outside police headquarters doubled overnight. By morning, the mayor's office issued a formal statement. Effective immediately, Assistant Chief William Cormack has been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. The city will cooperate fully with state and federal agencies in ensuring accountability within the Houston Police Department. Darren read the statement on his phone, his grip tightening. Administrative leave, not arrested, not fired, not justice. Ava sighed, rubbing her temple. It's not enough. Darren exhaled slowly. No, but it's a start. That night, Ava was locking up the community center when her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A cold, distorted voice slithered through the speaker. You think this is over? It's not, and next time we won't miss. The line went dead. Ava's hands trembled. The fight wasn't over, but neither was she. The threat still echoed in Ava Carter's ears long after the call had ended. You think this is over? It's not, and next time, we won't miss. She stood frozen in the dim glow of the community center's parking lot, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. Her breath came fast, her heart slamming against her ribs. Then, headlights flashed in the distance. Ava's stomach knotted. Her first instinct was to run, but instead she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. If they thought she was going to back down, they didn't know who they were dealing with. The car rolled past without stopping, disappearing into the night. Still, the message was clear. This wasn't over. By morning, Darren sat in the Internal Affairs office, watching as officers escorted William Cormack out of police headquarters in handcuffs. The charges were serious abuse of power, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. The headlines rolled in fast. Houston Assistant Police Chief arrested in widening corruption probe. City officials promise police reform after explosive investigation. Reckoning for Houston PD? Darren should have felt victorious, but he didn't, because he knew how the system worked. Cormack's lawyers would fight the charges, he'd make a deal, he'd take a plea, and even if he fell, the system itself would survive. That afternoon, Darren received a formal letter from the department. Captain Carter, we are pleased to inform you that your suspension has been lifted, and you are reinstated to full duty. He stared at the words, reading them over twice. They expected him to return, to put the badge back on, to pretend like nothing happened. When he showed Ava the letter, she shook her head. You're not seriously considering going back? Darren let out a slow breath. I don't know. Darren, her voice was gentle but firm. You fought too hard to go back to a system that tried to destroy us. She was right. That night, Darren sat at the kitchen table, badge in one hand, a resignation letter in the other. He had always believed he could change things from the inside, but he wasn't naive anymore. The next morning, he walked into police headquarters one last time, not to reclaim his position, but to walk away from it. He handed his resignation to the chief of police, meeting his gaze without hesitation. The system is broken, Darren said, and I won't be a part of it anymore. Without his badge, Darren felt strangely free. Meanwhile, Ava threw herself into the community center expanding programs, partnering with legal organizations to provide support for victims of police misconduct. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for everyone the system had silenced. But just when they thought they could breathe, a rock crashed through their front window. Ava and Darren bolted toward the sound, glass crunching under their feet. On the floor, a cardboard sign lay amidst the shattered glass. You should have stayed quiet. Ava looked at Darren, her hands shaking. His face was calm, but his fists were clenched. The fight wasn't over, and neither were they. The shattered glass still crunched under Darren Carter's boots as he picked up the cardboard sign, its bold red letters glaring back at him. "You should have stayed quiet." Ava stood beside him, her breathing slow and measured, but Darren could see the tension in her shoulders. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The media was still running headlines about Cormac's downfall, calling it a win for accountability, claiming it proved that the system worked. But Darren and Ava knew better. The department had cut out one man to protect the rest. Officers like Calloway and Sutton still had their defenders, still had powerful allies working in the shadows, and now, the same system that tried to break them was trying to erase them. A week after his resignation, Darren sat across from Jessica Lane, the journalist who had exposed their fight to the world. "So what's next for you?" Jessica asked, her recorder sitting between them on the table. Darren didn't hesitate. "The work isn't done." Ava, sitting beside him, nodded. "We didn't fight this hard just to let things go back to the way they were." Together, they launched the Carter Justice Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to exposing police misconduct, pushing for policy reform, and providing legal aid to victims of wrongful arrests and racial profiling. The community rallied behind them. Donations poured in. Lawyers offered pro bono services. Activists and families who had been silenced before now had a voice. But with visibility came new dangers. One night, after a long meeting at the community center, Darren's phone buzzed with a blocked number. He answered. A voice, low and familiar. "You think you're safe? You're not. This city will chew you up and spit you out. Walk away while you still can." Darren's grip tightened around the phone. "You don't scare me." A pause, then a soft chuckle. "We'll see." The line went dead. That night, as Ava and Darren sat in their dimly lit living room, she turned to him, her face serious. "Do you think we made a difference?" Darren exhaled, staring at the scars their fight had left behind. "We made it harder for them to ignore us." Ava reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "Then we keep going." As they locked up the community center the next evening, they didn't look over their shoulders. They weren't afraid, because justice wasn't a destination, it was a fight, and they were just getting started. The story of Ava and Darren Carter is a stark reminder that justice is never freely given. It must be fought for, often at great personal cost. Their battle against corruption reveals a truth that many who have lived long enough already understand. Power does not surrender willingly. Those who expose wrongdoing will face resistance, intimidation, and even betrayal. Yet their courage teaches us that silence is complicity, and standing firm against injustice can ignite real change, even if the battle is exhausting. For those who have witnessed decades of history, this lesson is familiar. Many have seen movements rise and fall, rights hard-won, only to be challenged again. But just as previous generations fought for fairness, equality, and truth, so too must today's society remain vigilant. The Carter family's journey reminds us that fear cannot dictate our actions. Whether in personal life or within the broader community, integrity requires perseverance. Standing up for what is right may not bring immediate relief, but it paves the way for a future where the next generation does not have to fight the same battles. True change begins when good people refuse to stay silent. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.